September 1945. A makeshift prison camp on a windswept Pacific island. The air thick with salt and uncertainty. Japanese women prisoners shuffled through processing lines, heads down, bracing for the humiliation they'd been taught to expect from their American captors. They had grown up hearing that enemy soldiers were savage beasts who would strip away every last piece of dignity, but then something impossible happened. Instead of degradation, they were handed thick white towels. Instead of cold hoses, they were shown to private shower stalls with actual hot water. And instead of being watched like animals, the guards turned their backs. Aiko Takahashi stood frozen as steam rose around her, clutching a bar of real soap, something she hadn't seen in years. Her skin squeaked clean for the first time since the war began, and tears mixed with the shower water she tried to hide. These weren't monsters. They were treating her like a human being. If you want to hear more untold stories from history that'll blow your mind, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The transport ship groaned against the Pacific swells as it pulled into the harbor, its hull scarred by months of war and weather. September had brought cooler winds to the island, but the air still hung heavy with salt and the lingering smoke of a conflict that had finally, impossibly, ended. Aiko Takahashi pressed her face to the small porthole, watching the approaching shoreline through eyes that had learned not to hope for much of anything anymore. She had folded her few belongings into a tight square that morning, the way her mother had taught her to fold towels, corners, meeting corners, edges straight and true. It was one of the small rituals that kept her tethered to who she had been before the world turned upside down. The other women around her whispered in the dim hold, their voices mixing fear and resignation in equal measure. They had all heard the stories about American prison camps, about the brutality that awaited captured enemies. The radio broadcasts back home had painted vivid pictures of savage soldiers who took pleasure in humiliation, who saw Japanese prisoners as less than human. When the ship's engines finally shuddered to silence, Aiko straightened her thin cotton dress and joined the line of women shuffling toward the gangplank. Her hands were steady. They had to be steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped onto American soil for the first time in her life. The afternoon sun felt different here, sharper somehow, cutting through the familiar gray of the Pacific sky. The processing station was a collection of wooden buildings that looked hastily assembled, but surprisingly clean. American soldiers in pressed khaki uniforms stood at attention, their faces mostly neutral, professional. Aiko had expected snarling beasts. Instead, she found young men who looked tired and ready to go home, just like everyone else. One of them, a Japanese-American interpreter with careful eyes and ink-stained fingers, stepped forward with a clipboard. "Takahashi, Aiko," he said, pronouncing each syllable with deliberate precision. His English carried the slight accent of someone who had grown up speaking two languages, switching between them like a person walking between two different worlds. "Is that correct?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He wrote her name in the ledger with the same careful attention she gave to folding towels, each Roman letter formed as if it mattered. As if she mattered. "This way, please," said a woman in a crisp, white nurse's uniform. Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "We'll get you settled and cleaned up." Cleaned up. The words should have carried threat, the promise of forced submission. But there was something in the nurse's tone that suggested otherwise. Ruth Ellison moved with the same methodical care as the interpreter, leading the group of women toward a long, low building that steamed slightly in the cooling air. "Hot showers," Ruth explained, pausing at the entrance. "You'll each have 15 minutes. There are towels and soap provided." She gestured to neat stacks of white towels, thick and clean, and small bars of ivory soap still wrapped in paper. Real soap. Aiko hadn't seen real soap in over a year. The other women murmured among themselves, confusion evident in their voices. This wasn't what they had been prepared for. The propaganda machine back home had ground out story after story of American cruelty, of prisoners stripped of dignity and basic humanity. But here were towels. Here was soap. Here was privacy. Inside the shower building, canvas curtains hung from metal rings, creating individual stalls. The floors were wooden slats, worn smooth but clean. Pipes ran along the walls, ending in simple showerheads that dripped with the promise of hot water. A female guard stood near the door, but her back was turned toward the wall, her posture suggesting she had no interest in watching anything that didn't concern security. Aiko stepped into her assigned stall and pulled the curtain closed behind her. The canvas was thick enough to provide real privacy, soft enough to suggest care rather than confinement. She stood there for a long moment, holding the bar of soap like a small miracle, its clean scent rising between her fingers. When she finally turned the handle, hot water cascaded over her shoulders, washing away months of accumulated grime and fear. The soap lathered rich and white, sliding across her skin with a luxury she had almost forgotten existed. For the first time since the war began, her skin squeaked clean under her fingertips. The sound was so unexpected, so normal, that tears began to mix with the shower water streaming down her face. She pressed her lips together, trying to keep the sobs silent, but something fundamental had shifted, in the space between expectation and reality. These weren't monsters. These were people treating her like a person, with dignity she hadn't dared hope for. The propaganda had prepared her for degradation, but it hadn't prepared her for mercy. The days began to take on a rhythm that surprised Aiko with its gentleness. Each morning at 7, Sergeant May Doyle's whistle would cut through the barracks air, not harsh or punishing, but clear and predictable. The women would rise, fold their thin blankets with the same precision Aiko brought to everything, and line up for the walk to the mess hall. Breakfast was watery oatmeal and coffee that tasted like burnt wood, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. By the third week, Aiko had memorized the schedule posted on the bulletin board outside the administrative office. Showers every other day at 2 o'clock, laundry on Mondays and Thursdays, sewing class on Tuesday and Friday afternoons in the recreation hall. And on Sundays, if supplies allowed, there would be tinned peaches served with the evening meal, a small luxury that felt enormous after months of rice balls and pickled vegetables. The shower building had become a place of quiet sanctuary. Ruth Ellison had convinced the camp commander to install a proper privacy curtain after the first week, when one of the canvas dividers had torn loose from its rings during a particularly busy session. Instead of punishment or humiliation, there had been gentle laughter from the other women, and a quick repair with medical tape. The incident had revealed something important. Even their mistakes were met with patience, rather than cruelty. Kenji Sato spent his days hunched over ledgers and typewriters, fighting small wars with paperwork that most people would never notice. Aiko watched him sometimes through the window of the administrative office, his pen moving with deliberate care across forms and manifests. She had learned that he was Nisei American-born but Japanese by blood, and that he carried the weight of proving his loyalty to a country that had locked up his own family while he served in uniform. "Your name," he had told her during one of their brief interactions, "is not a number. I make sure it stays that way." He showed her the ledger, where each woman was listed, not as prisoner 247 or subject 089, but as their full names written in careful script: Takahashi, Aiko, Nakamura, Chiyo, Yamamoto, Sachiko. Each name was a small act of resistance against the machinery that sought to reduce human beings to administrative conveniences. Ruth moved through her duties with the same methodical kindness she brought to everything. She had sectioned off a corner of the medical station to treat minor injuries and ailments, and word had spread quickly that the American nurse didn't ask questions that weren't medical in nature. When Aiko burned her hand on the laundry steam press, Ruth cleaned and bandaged the wound with gentle efficiency, never once making her feel foolish for the accident. "Healing requires dignity," Ruth murmured as she wrapped Aiko's hand with clean gauze. "I learned that from my grandmother. She said you can't mend a person if you break their spirit first." The words were spoken quietly, almost to herself, but Aiko heard them and tucked them away like a small treasure. The sewing classes had become unexpectedly popular. Sister Agnes Moran from the Red Cross had somehow procured needles, thread, and scraps of fabric from the supply depot, transforming what could have been busy work into something approaching normalcy. Aiko found herself teaching the other women techniques her mother had shown her: how to reinforce a seam, how to darn a sock so the repair was nearly invisible, how to make something beautiful from scraps that others might discard. Chiyo Nakamura sat beside her during these sessions, her fingers quick and sure with the needle. She had been a seamstress apprentice before the war, and her natural cheerfulness helped lighten the atmosphere in the recreation hall. She would hum popular songs while she worked, sometimes getting the other women to join in. The guards never told them to be quiet. "Do you think they're fattening us up for something worse?" Chiyo whispered one afternoon as they mended torn blankets. It was the kind of question that lived in the back of everyone's mind, the fear that kindness was just another form of manipulation. Aiko considered this as she guided her needle through a particularly stubborn piece of wool. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know that yesterday I was treated like a human being. Today I was treated like a human being. Tomorrow." She let the sentence hang unfinished, but her meaning was clear. Tomorrow would have to take care of itself. On Sunday evening, when the tinned peaches appeared on their meal trays, Aiko ate hers slowly, making each sweet bite last. Around her, the other women did the same, savoring not just the fruit, but the small miracle of unexpected kindness. Later, as they walked back to the barracks under a sky painted in shades of orange and purple, Chiyo began humming a hymn she had learned from Ruth during one of their medical visits. The melody was simple and sweet, something about being gathered safely in. Aiko found herself humming along, and soon other voices joined them. Even Sergeant Doyle, walking her evening patrol, seemed to soften her step as the women's voices drifted across the compound. It was a small sound in a large world, but it was theirs, and nobody tried to take it away. The news came on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by Kenji with the kind of careful precision he brought to everything important. The women had gathered in the recreation hall for their usual sewing session when he appeared in the doorway, a manila folder clutched against his chest and something that might have been hope flickering in his dark eyes. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying across the room with unusual formality, "I have an announcement from the Geneva Exchange Commission." The women set down their needles and thread, turning toward him with the kind of attention that comes when someone might be about to change your life. "Your names have been placed on the repatriation manifest. You're going home." The silence that followed was so complete that Aiko could hear the wind rattling the windows and the distant sound of someone typing in the administrative office. Then Chiyo let out a small cry that was part sob, part laughter, and the spell broke. Women began embracing each other, tears streaming down faces that had grown used to guarding against hope. Ruth appeared at Kenji's shoulder, her nurse's uniform crisp as always, but her eyes bright with something that looked suspiciously like tears. "The ship leaves in 3 weeks," she added gently. "We'll make sure everyone has proper documentation and medical clearance." She paused, looking around the room at faces that had become familiar. "Even dear, I know this is what you've all been waiting for." That evening, without anyone organizing it or asking permission, the women gathered in the shower building after the official bathing hours had ended. Chiyo had suggested it during dinner, a ceremony, she called it, to mark the moment when they learned they were going home. They brought their precious bars of soap, most of them worn down to slivers by weeks of careful use. Aiko held her soap wrapper in her palm, the paper soft and translucent from handling. She had kept it folded inside her diary, between pages, where she wrote 2 careful lines each night. Observations about the weather, about small kindnesses, about the gradual restoration of something she was only beginning to recognize as hope. Now, she pressed the wrapper flat against a page that held a sketch of the shower building, the simple lines capturing the place where her world had shifted from expectation to mercy. "Like bookmarks," Chiyo said softly, demonstrating how the wrapper could mark a page. "To remember." Around the room, other women were doing the same, tucking soap wrappers into prayer books and journals, into letters they planned to write home, into the small collections of belongings that constituted their entire material world. Sister Agnes Moran had somehow procured a few extra bars of soap for the journey, along with small cloth bags to carry personal items. She moved among the women with her usual quiet efficiency, but even she seemed touched by the solemnity of the moment. "Dignity?" she murmured to Ruth as they watched the women carefully preserve their soap wrappers. "It's the little things that preserve dignity." But 3 days later, the little things began to crack apart. The news came in fragments, the way bad news always seemed to arrive first, a whispered conversation between guards, then Kenji's increasingly worried expression. Finally, an official announcement that hit like cold water. A transport ship, carrying repatriated prisoners from another camp, had gone down in a storm off the Philippines. No casualties, but the incident had triggered a review of all exchange protocols. Photography of any kind was now banned, no pictures of departing prisoners that might send mixed messages about American treatment of enemies. All personal items would be subject to additional inspection. Aiko watched from her barracks window as uniformed men carried boxes of confiscated belongings from the women's quarters: diaries, letters, prayer books, anything that might contain information deemed sensitive. Her own diary disappeared along with the rest, taking with it her careful observations and the soap wrapper that had become a symbol of unexpected grace. The trust that had grown so carefully over weeks began to fray at the edges. Had the kindness been performance after all? Was the gentleness just another form of control? The questions circulated through the barracks like fever, and even Chiyo's natural optimism seemed dimmed by doubt. Ruth found Aiko sitting alone in the recreation hall the next evening, staring at her empty hands. "They'll return the diaries," she said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "Once they've been cleared. It's just procedure." "Is it?" Aiko asked, and the question hung between them like a challenge. For the first time since arriving at the camp, she sounded like what she was, a prisoner, questioning her captor's motives. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap with the same precision Aiko brought to her own small rituals. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "But I know that some things can't be taken away, even when everything else disappears. The kindness you've received, that's real. The dignity you've maintained, that's yours." She paused, then added more softly, "Sometimes faith means believing in mercy, even when the evidence seems mixed." The red stamp appeared on a Thursday morning like a small apocalypse, bold and final across the top of Aiko's transport document. Lieutenant Walter Harrigan had processed the paperwork with his usual brisk efficiency, signing forms and checking boxes without looking up from his desk, until Kenji cleared his throat with the kind of polite insistence that meant trouble. "Sir, there's a discrepancy," Kenji said, his voice carefully neutral as he held up two different documents. "The manifest lists her as Takahashi, Aiko, but the identification card has the kana romanization as Takahashi. The computer generated a mismatch flag." Harrigan barely glanced at the papers. "Then she's reassigned to the next transport. Simple administrative correction." He reached for his stamp pad, the red ink still wet from his morning's work. "Next case." "Sir, if I could just verify the correct spelling," Kenji began, but Harrigan was already pressing the stamp down with decisive force. "Reassigned." The letters bled slightly into the paper fiber, as permanent as a gravestone inscription. "The manifest is final, Sergeant. We can't delay an entire ship because someone can't spell their own name consistently." Harrigan waved his hand dismissively. "She'll go on the next available transport. Probably won't be more than a few weeks." Kenji stared at the red stamp, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. "Sir, with respect, the error appears to be in our transcription, not hers. I have her original intake forms. The decision is made, Sergeant." Harrigan's tone carried the finality of a door slamming shut. "Unless you have some compelling military reason to question my administrative judgment." Outside the administrative office, Aiko waited with her small bundle of belongings, watching through the window as her fate was decided by men arguing over the placement of a single letter. She could see Kenji's shoulders tense, could see him shuffling through papers with increasing urgency, could see Harrigan's growing impatience with the delay. When Kenji finally emerged, his face told her everything she needed to know. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "There's been a clerical error. You'll need to wait for the next transport." The words hit her like cold water. Around her, the other women were gathering their belongings, chattering with nervous excitement about the journey home. Chiyo appeared at her elbow, concern creasing her usually cheerful features. "What's wrong?" Chiyo asked, but even as she spoke, understanding was dawning in her eyes. "No, they can't separate us now. Not when we're so close, but they could." and they had. By afternoon, Aiko stood at the compound fence, watching her closest friend board the transport truck that would take the women to the harbor. Chio pressed her face to the back window, mouthing promises to wait for her, to find her family, to remember everything. The truck disappeared around the bend in the road, leaving behind only dust and the hollow ache of abandonment. Ruth found her there an hour later, still gripping the chain-link fence. "This isn't right," Ruth said, her usual professional calm cracked by obvious anger. "I've filed a formal complaint with Captain Denton. Kenji has documentation proving the error was ours." "Will it matter?" Aiko asked, her voice flat with exhaustion. Ruth hesitated, then answered with characteristic honesty. "I don't know, but I won't stop trying." That evening, Kenji appeared at the barracks with an armload of folders and a grim determination that reminded Aiko of her father, preparing for a difficult business negotiation. He spread papers across the common table intake forms, wage chits from the work details, medical records, even the roster cards from the sewing classes. "Your name appears 37 different times in camp records," he announced, pointing to each document in turn. 36 times it's spelled correctly as Takahashi. Only once, on the computer punch card that generated the manifest, is it spelled wrong. He looked up at her with something fierce burning in his dark eyes. "Paper trails don't lie, even when people try to ignore them." Corporal Eddie Ruiz, the young records clerk who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward nervously. "I could retype the card," he offered quietly. "If someone official requested it. Clean copy, proper spelling." "The manifest is already filed," Kenji replied. But his tone suggested he was thinking through possibilities rather than accepting defeat. That night, Aiko walked to the shower building alone. The space felt vast and empty without the other women, the silence broken only by the steady drip of faucets that never quite sealed properly. She turned one of the handles anyway, watching hot water cascade into the drain, carrying nothing away because there was nothing left to wash. She had saved one small sliver of soap, hoarding it like a talisman against the day when even small mercies might disappear. Now she held it in her palm, feeling its smooth weight, remembering the first shocking kindness of steam and privacy and water that ran clean. The soap had grown translucent with use, worn thin by weeks of careful rationing, but it still carried the faint scent of something better than she had dared hope for. In the morning, she would try again to prove that she existed, that her name meant something, that a single letter shouldn't have the power to erase a person's chance at freedom. But tonight, she pressed the soap to her wrist like a small prayer and tried to remember what hope felt like. The wash house felt different in the gray light of dawn, empty except for Aiko, and the sound of water dripping from pipes that had seen too many seasons of Pacific weather. She sat on the wooden bench, where women had once chatted while waiting their turns, holding the sliver of soap that had become her last tangible connection to the time when kindness seemed possible. The soap was nearly gone now, worn down to a translucent wafer that barely filled her palm, but she pressed it against her wrist anyway, a ritual that had become prayer. 3 weeks had passed since the red stamp had severed her from the life she had almost dared to imagine. 3 weeks of appeals that disappeared into filing cabinets, of promises that tomorrow would bring news, of watching empty bunks where her friends had once slept. The compound had filled with new prisoners, men this time, transferred from another camp, and the rhythm of her days had shifted to accommodate their presence. The shower building was now divided by schedule rather than privacy, the women's hours compressed into smaller windows that felt more like ration time than sanctuary. She closed her eyes and tried to remember Chio's voice, humming hymns in the evening light. Tried to hold on to the memory of Ruth's gentle hands, treating her burned palm. Tried to resurrect the feeling of steam rising around her like a blessing she hadn't known she needed. But memory felt fragile in the face of abandonment, and hope had become something she rationed more carefully than soap. The door to the wash house creaked open, letting in a shaft of stronger light and the sound of footsteps on wooden slats. Aiko looked up to see Ruth approaching with something in her hands, a manila envelope, and an expression that might have been carefully controlled excitement. "Your diary," Ruth said simply, holding out the envelope. It's been cleared. Aiko's hands trembled as she opened the envelope and pulled out the familiar notebook with its worn blue cover and pages filled with her careful script. But there was something else. An official stamp in green ink that read, "Cleared," in block letters. And beneath it, a signature she didn't recognize. She flipped through the pages, finding her soap wrapper still pressed between the sketch of the shower building and her observations about the gradual restoration of dignity. "Kenji won the appeal," Ruth continued, settling beside her on the bench. "Eddie Ruiz retyped your identification card with the correct spelling. 3 times, actually, until he got the carbon copies perfect. Your name is back on the manifest for the next transport." The words seemed to come from a great distance, filtered through weeks of disappointment that had taught her not to trust good news too quickly. "When?" she managed to ask. 2 days, Ruth replied. Captain Denton signed the orders himself. Lieutenant Harrigan was overruled. She paused, then added with quiet satisfaction. "Apparently, proper documentation matters more than administrative convenience." Aiko clutched the diary against her chest, feeling the solid reality of pages that contained her own thoughts in her own handwriting. The soap wrapper crinkled softly between the pages, a small sound that somehow contained all the weeks of uncertainty and the sudden, overwhelming possibility of freedom. "There's something else," Ruth said. "We're having a formation this afternoon. Nothing official, just a reading of names for the transport manifest. Captain Denton thought it might be good for morale recognition, rather than just processing." The formation took place on the parade ground at 3 o'clock, with the autumn sun slanting low across the compound. A small crowd had gathered prisoners waiting for their own transports. Guards finishing their shifts. Medical staff who had found reasons to step outside. Ruth stood behind a simple podium with a tinny microphone that crackled with static, holding the official manifest in her steady hands. "The following individuals have been cleared for repatriation," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. "When I call your name, please step forward." One by one, she read the names with careful pronunciation, each syllable given its proper weight and dignity. Not numbers, not classifications, names. Full names that belonged to real people, with histories and families and futures that stretched beyond the boundaries of this temporary place. "Takahashi, Aiko," Ruth called, and Aiko stepped forward on legs that felt uncertain but determined. Her name hung in the air for a moment, solid and complete, before being caught by the wind and carried across the compound like a small victory. The next morning, she stood at the compound gate with her diary tucked securely in her bundle of belongings. The soap wrapper was still pressed between its pages, no longer a symbol of what might be lost, but a reminder of what had been preserved: dignity in the face of systems designed to erase it, mercy that had proven stronger than bureaucracy, restraint that had become a form of strength. Ruth and Kenji stood at the fence, watching as she boarded the transport truck that would take her to the harbor and the ship that would carry her home. She pressed her palm against the window in a gesture that might have been goodbye or gratitude or simple acknowledgement that some kindnesses change everything, even when they come from the most unexpected places.